In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. A fun movie I've seen several times, which I love, is the adaptation of Jane Austen's novel Sense and Sensibility by Emma Thompson. She also stars in it. And the movie opens with a young man named John promising his father on his deathbed that he will care for his father's second wife and their children, his half-sisters. And then after the funeral, John and his wife Fanny have this ongoing conversation trying to determine how much money is appropriate for John to give his stepmother and half-sisters. Because without any income from him, they are virtually destitute, and the girls would have no dowry. But Fanny is greedy and not willing to share. So John first suggests a gift of £3,000 so that they may live on the interest. And Fanny frowns and suggests he is too generous. Later in another scene, John says, well, 1,500 then. What do you say to £1,500? Fanny said, a brother on earth would do half so much for his real sisters, let alone half-blood. Another scene, John says, well, how about £100 a year to the mother while she lives? Would that be more advisable? It's better than parting with the $1,500 all at once. Fanny says, but if she should live longer than 15 years, we would be completely taken in. People always live forever when there's an annuity to be paid. The final scene is, John says, so we are agreed. No money, but the occasional gift of game and fish in season will be very welcome. Inheritance. Be a tricky business, even between family members. As with the Dashwoods, this family, Sense and Sensibility, greed often plays a role. This challenge has been plaguing families for thousands of years, as we hear in our gospel lesson today. Jesus is confronted with a young man who apparently feels cheated by his brother with their inheritance. He asks Jesus to arbitrate. Jesus declines, but uses this as a teaching moment to discuss greed. And it's summarized in his words, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And he then goes on to tell this parable about the rich man who has a good harvest. And it's so big he decides to build a bigger barn, but God says, don't get so content because you will die this very night for all that wealth. So at first glance, the rich man hasn't done anything wrong. He has a big crop, which is good. He builds a bigger barn, which is practical. Nothing wrong with that. The problem comes with his attitude. He says to himself, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. There are two things wrong with this statement. One is he's assuming that all this extra money is going to make him happy. And he's assuming that he, and not God, is in control of his life. Recently, there have been a number of studies done on the concept of happiness. What makes us happy? How do we stay happy? The answers are very much in line with what Jesus advocates throughout the Gospels, beginning with his claim that money and possessions do not make us happy. Of course, they are very important for ensuring we have the basics of food and clothing and shelter. But beyond that, once those basic needs are taken care of, money and possessions don't do a whole lot for Studies show that our level of happiness is determined by 3 different things. 50% of our happiness is genetically predisposed. In other words, we all have sort of a basic level of happiness with which we are born. It's called our set point of happiness. For some people it's higher, for some people it's lower. And we have no control over that. Another 40% of our happiness is determined by actions under our control. And I'll get to that in a minute. However, only 10% of our happiness is determined by life circumstances, whether you are rich or poor, healthy, unhealthy, married, divorced, all. Yes, these things are important, but again, as long as our basic human needs are taken care of in and of themselves, these sorts of things don't have a huge impact on our happiness. What does have an impact on our happiness, and which is in our control, is found in that 40%. And that is primarily found in relationships with others, as well as having meaningful work to do. Relationships and meaningful work. We can control 40% of our happiness with how strong our social connections are with family, friends, and community. I suspect Jesus looked to that young man who was arguing with his brother about the inheritance and saw not only greed, but a broken relationship. Jesus wouldn't arbitrate because that would just make winners and losers between the brothers, rather than fostering a healed relationship. Greed is evil not only because it provides a false promise of happiness, but because it breaks down relationships. Time and again, Jesus tells us that relationships with God and others is at the heart of the gospel. Loving God and loving neighbor. And greed distorts that. An article about happiness says, happiness then is about family, community, and well-being. It cannot be determined by a certain level of material comfort. Instead, it stems from having meaningful connections with others and meaningful things to do. These projects are especially valuable if they're not contained at the individual level, but involve some form of sharing, cooperation, or contribution to other people's well-being. As Richard Layard, the well-known economist and now one of the leading authorities on happiness, says, society cannot flourish without some sense of shared purpose, meaning. So the assumption by the rich man in the parable that all this extra money on its own is going to make him happy for years to come, and that he can just now kind of lay back and relax and eat, drink, and be merry, and not share it or connect with others or connect with God, that attitude is wrong. And his second assumption, that he is in control of his life, is also problematic, because after listening to the man confidently planning his happy life, God says to him, you fool, this very night, your life is being demanded of you. Life can change on a dime. We all know that. This man is confident, he's got everything under control. In reality, his life is about to end. Yes, we have a certain amount of control within certain parameters, but the large pieces of our life are in God's hands. This man has no sense of gratitude to God for his good fortune. He expresses no desire to share this good fortune with others, or to use his new free time to foster relationships with God or others. He sees his wealth as something he acquired on his own, which he will use for his own benefit, with no obligations to God, family, friends, or community. He's storing up treasures for himself alone. As Jesus says time and again, being rich towards God means loving God and neighbor, building relationships. How do we do this? How do we turn away from a love of possessions and turn towards a relationship with God and others? It isn't always easy. We're often taught in our society that life is competitive. That we should look out for number one. Building relationships instead of bank accounts is not always second nature. It takes practice and prayer, grace of God. So when you're deciding between two things, I'm reminded of a wonderful Native American story. An elder Native American was teaching his grandchildren about life. And he said to them, "There's a fight going on inside of me. It's a terrible fight, and it's between two wolves. One wolf represents fear, anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. The other wolf stands for joy, peace, love, sharing, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, friendship, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, faith." Two wolves. And the grandfather says, this same fight is going on inside each one of you too. And inside every other person as well. The grandchildren thought about it for a minute, and then one child asked his grandfather, "Which wolf will win?" The old Cherokee simply replied, "The one you feed."